So you know that going up and standing in front of your peers and talking about what you do is probably the most just uncomfortable thing you can do. And I think Lee said earlier today, we need to have some new thinking, creative thinking, being outside of the box. We talked about there is no right answer. So these guys coming up are going to put themselves out there and show their creative side and demonstrate that they don't have the answer, but they have an approach. And so we've brought 3 examples in for this afternoon, and I tried to cover the range of the spotted owl from Washington, where there's just like Fred, Mary, Louise, and George left, right? So the 4 they're managing up there. Oh. The Umpqua in the west side of the Cascades, and then Northern California. So you can get an idea of some approaches in 3 different sort of physiographic areas. So Josh Chapman's going to kick this off for us. He's down in the Umpqua National Forest, where he's the forest wildlife biologist, and he's going to put himself out there for you and show one of his examples. So help me welcome Josh.
Can you hear me? All right, good deal. So I'm going to start off the presentation. There's a little risk of Cheryl asking you to do a presentation and asking you for a title of your presentation before you actually put your presentation together. So this is a process, it says here, and I'm going to frame this more as considerations, things that we're looking at a landscape level to try and identify restoration opportunities across the forest. We don't have any one project where we're using every single one of these items that I'm going to discuss, but we do take these into consideration when we're planning our larger landscape level projects there. And I wanted to start this presentation off with a picture of the whiskey complex there that burnt this summer on the Umpqua, all within critical habitat, and want to use this kind of as just a framework. You know, this fire was a couple fires that burned up a total of 18,000 acres, but it didn't burn up. It treated 18,000 acres approximately, only about 10% high severity, really nice fire from a wildlife perspective. And just want to acknowledge the fact that in southwestern Oregon, that's how we're treating the majority of our critical habitat at this point in time, is through natural disturbances like wildfire. And so, as you can see, we've got a nice mosaic there. Some mortality, some green trees, a lot of underburning, little pockets of high severity, but overall a really nice fire. So the objectives of the talk today is to kind of talk about the uniqueness of the Umpqua, where we are, and talk about the 2 different critical habitat units that are encompassed on the Umpqua. Want to talk about those considerations that I mentioned before, some habitat features, risks, restoration opportunities that we're looking at, and then discuss also some biotic and abiotic variables that we're using to help identify areas of restoration opportunities, both within and outside of critical habitat. And so that's the Umpqua there in the black outline, and that's overlaid with the critical habitat. And so those different colored blobs are the different critical habitat units. And so you can see the Umpqua, we've combined 2 different units there. So the northern 2/3 of our forest roughly are in the West Cascades South subunit, or unit, and then the bottom third of our forest, the Tiller Ranger District, is in the Klamath East. And that's going to come into play because there's different management considerations based upon those units. And here, I just wanted to overlay, kind of building off of what Brendan and Bruce were just talking about, critical habitat overlaid upon the Northwest Forest Plan land use allocations there. And so as you can see at the bottom, the Umpqua is 60% critical habitat, and of our matrix, about 65% of that is critical habitat. And of that remaining 35%, there's in the neighborhood of 10 to 12% inventoried roadless on top of that. So our amount of non-critical habitat matrix is actually pretty small relative to the matrix overall. And interestingly enough, you know, based upon the modeling that occurred, not all of our late successional reserve is critical habitat. You know, there's about 25% of our LSR that falls outside of critical habitat boundaries. So again, those 2 subunits there, the north being the Western Cascades South and the Klamath East, and I'm going to go over the reasons why those 2 units were identified and then the special management considerations for them. The threshold there between those modeling regions, the Klamath and the Western Cascade South really changed the special management considerations, and so I'll talk about those here shortly. So the reason Western Cascade South Subunit 5 was identified was, the current threats that we've been talking about this morning, current and past timber harvests, and then barred owl occupancy. We don't have a lot of good recent spotted owl survey information on a widespread portion of the Umpqua. We do have some project-specific areas, and we have been, over the past decade at least, been detecting more barred owls on the forest. The purpose of designation of this subunit is for demographic support, and then east-west and north-south connectivity. So, being that this subunit is it's in the Western Cascades. It's the southernmost subunit of the Western Cascades out of the 5 subunits there, but the focus is really on younger forest, on conserving the older forest there, conserving the older stands that contain the conditions to support NSO occupancy or high-value northern spotted owl habitat, as described in Recovery Actions 10 and 32. And just real briefly, Recovery Action 10 is a prioritization process there where if you know the occupancy of your owls and you know the reproductive output of your owls there, you want to focus your attention on maintaining that suitable habitat in those reproducing pair sites there, those sites that are reproducing young. And it's kind of hierarchical. If you got an occupied pair, that's the next level. If you've got an occupied single, that's the next level, and then down the line. But it kind of sets you up from a management perspective for more of that stand level management of where you need to focus on retaining owl habitat based upon the occupancy and the reproduction outputs of the owls. And then Recovery Action 32, been touched upon in the past, but just want to hit it one more time. It's that high quality owl habitat. So multiple canopy layers, large amounts of snags and downwood, large diameter trees, and that's something that the Umpqua, fortunate enough, we've got the highest percent of nesting, roosting, foraging habitat on a per acre basis of any forest within the range of the spotted owl in Oregon and Washington there. And that's a great opportunity for us, and it's a little bit of a limiting factor too in some of our management opportunities for producing timber volume. The next special management consideration is management emphasis needs to be placed on meeting recovery goals and long-term ecosystem restoration and conservation, where there's a conflict between those actions that would disturb or remove the essential physical or biological features that Jim talked about earlier, will need to be minimized and reconciled with the long-term ecosystem restoration goals. And then we want to continue to manage for large contiguous blocks of late successional forest, and that in areas that are not currently late successional forest or high-valued habitat, that those are the areas where, the really active management, that ecological forestry means a whole bunch of things. I haven't heard a single definition of it today, and I'm not going to provide one here either, but like it or not, when I hear ecological forestry, I think heavier-handed timber management, not necessarily plantation thinning. That may not be everybody's definition of it, but that's kind of how I've been hearing it. And those areas we should focus on. If we're going to apply those treatments, we should be focusing those within the Western Cascade South and those younger stands. And so the Klamath East, that's the subunit to the south there. It occurs entirely on the Tiller Ranger District. The same threats, current and past timber harvest and barred owls, but then they add the third, the loss of habitat from wildfire. And by far, that is the single biggest loss of habitat on the Umpqua National Forest. In a few minutes here, I'll show you a slide of fire disturbances on the forest over the past 2 decades there. And you'll see that well above and beyond any of our timber operations, restoration projects there, habitat loss from wildfire is the number one source of habitat loss on the Umpqua. The same purposes for this subunit, demographic support, east-west and north-south connectivity. And so the special management considerations here, it's a little bit like a Chinese menu. You can take a little bit of this one, and you can take a little bit of this one, and then you get to mix them together. So the moist forest stuff of the Western Cascade South, that focus on restoring young stands, but then in those areas where we have drier stands, you can focus vegetation and fuels management in dry and mixed forests that it says it may be appropriate both within and outside critical habitat where the goals of such treatment is to conserve the natural ecological processes or restore them, including fire, where they've been modified or suppressed. And so that's an interesting challenge, because for our projects, we need to clearly define when we're in that dry forest situation, when we're in that moist forest situation. And by and large, projects in the Klamath East and also some of the Western Cascade South Subunit 5 have a mixture of those two, and so we need to clearly delineate those when we're planning our projects. And so our approach for integrating ecological restoration, so we want to consider scale. We want to work from big to small, and that's what I'll primarily be talking about, is that larger landscape scale look. That's essential for integration of NSO into forest restoration planning there. And then need to know the landscape level context before we get down to that stand level prescription there. So taking the big look, and then when you actually get out on the ground planning your units there, then you're going to look at recovery action 10, recovery action 32. Is that a dry stand? Is that a moist stand? And develop those more specific, site-specific stand level treatments there. And then also to recognize or foster or mimic the role of fire in creating habitat mosaics, as well as maintaining within stand elements. And so like that stand level. And just another discussion there, explicit considerations of scale. So, the UMQA contains two different critical habitat units there, so that we've got both dry and moist. And so we need to focus on both restoring the young, but we also need to acknowledge that we need to take some actions to preserve the older, drier stands that we have. And then look down at the subunit, the watershed. What's the landscape level? That question, I'm not going to speak for the service or anything, but landscape typically to me is a 5th or 6th field huck, so 10 to 50,000 acres roughly in there. That's when we talk landscapes, that's roughly what we talk to. And one thing I just got to say is I'm glad I work for the Forest Service, because we actually have contiguous landscapes in which to manage, and that makes things a little bit easier for us as compared to the BLM. And then the home ranges and the stands there. So that home range, habitat quality and owl fitness, so that's getting a little bit at that recovery action 10, distribution of values based upon topography and forest structure, and looking about at the configuration of the habitat within those home ranges. And then at that stand, individual stand level, that's that R832 look, is it high quality habitat? Do we need to be treating in there? Is this a dry stand? Is this a moist stand? And that's when we develop our stand level prescriptions. And so these next, I'm just going to kind of go through a series of layers that we use at a forest level to help try and identify potential areas of restoration need. And these layers are not, at all meant to be used individually. They all kind of stack on top of each other. Some of them are correlated. But I just wanted to kind of give you guys some, kind of walk through some of the thought processes that we use and some of the considerations we do when we're identifying our planning areas. So the first one is, because we're, in southwestern Oregon, fire is such a big part of our landscape, is a large fire suitability model. This was developed as part of the 15-year monitoring plan for the Northwest Forest Plan for the monitoring of a northern spotted owl habitat, developed by Ray Davis there. It was a model that was trained, basically it's a relative habitat suitability model for large wildfires. And it was trained on historic wildfires, and some of the variables include the significant variables were August max temperature, slope, lightning ignitions, and then distance for road. Elevation, summer precipitation, and solar radiation all were variables, but those four, from August max temp down to distance to road, were really the main drivers of that model. And what this does at a forest level is allows us to key into a couple different locations here. Let's see. I should have tried this up front. There we go. So these blue areas here, a little bit more suitable for developing long-term habitat that's going to likely to last long-term into the landscape. How much do we actually want to develop high-quality late successional conditions in areas like this where they're much more likely to to be in a location where they're going to stand replaced there. And so it helps prioritize areas of need, of fuels treatment needs, but then it also prioritizes areas of restoration as well, areas where you can try and develop habitat that'll persevere on the landscape at a longer time scale. And this, you know, it's GNN habitat variables went into this, and so it's really only useful for applying at the fifth field watershed scale. And so you really can't use this for stand level identification. For that, you want to work with your fuels folks to do some kind of stand level fire risk modeling. Then the next layer we use, also coming off of the 15-year monitoring report for northern spotted owl, is the nesting, roosting, and dispersal habitat model, also developed for that 15-year monitoring report. And some of the key variables there that really help drive that model is conifer cover, large conifer density, diameter diversity index. And so the diversity of diameters of trees within an area there gives you an index, and that index is an index of heterogeneity there. It kind of talks to some of the complex structures associated with older forest habitat. And then stand age, other metrics that weren't quite as strong, but also contributed to the model is mean conifer DBH, stand height, and then it had, depending upon the modeling region, forest species composition variables. And so this is a different model than the one that was presented on earlier. This isn't the model that was used to develop critical habitat. This is a non-smooth model, so this is 30 meter pixel by 30 meter pixel, and classifies the habitat as either nesting, roosting, foraging, or dispersal habitat there on a continuous grade. And this is what we use as a base of our consultation there. And then, you know, because again, it's a model, the habitat variables are derived from GNN. We go out on the ground when we're planning our units and field verify it. And we edit this on a regular basis, saying, walking out, well, this really is a single story, non-diverse stand. It's more really dispersal habitat, not NERF, and so we'll edit this layer. And for watershed assessments, you know, again, the 6th or 5th field scale is appropriate to use this one. It's not smooth, so you can look at a stand scale, but you need to verify that stand scale look by actually walking on the ground and assessing that unit on your own. And then the other one we do use is the relative habitat suitability model that went into development for the critical habitat. And the reason why we use both of these is because this one was smoothed at that 200 hectare scale. And just so you guys understand what that means is, so there's a pixel and there's a 200 hectare or 500 acre circle around there. It takes an average of all those other pixels within that circle and then provides a value to the inside of that primary pixel at the center of that. And so that smooth look aggregates the areas of higher quality, more contiguous habitat, and provides higher level values. So that darker green is it includes the biggest, most intact patches of spotted owl nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat there. And so that smooth level look is important because it gets at some of the core use area scale. And then the other thing that this model has that the nesting, roosting, foraging model doesn't have is abiotic features there. So there's elevation in here, there's curvature, there's slope, and some of those abiotic factors also obviously, you know, affect how owls use the landscape. And so it can kind of key you in on some areas that are higher quality habitat, combining abiotic and biotic factors at that 500 acre scale. And so it's another level look at habitat, and it helps us identify areas where we've got, you know, the bigger chunks of that higher quality habitat, more contiguous habitat. We might want to treat around those, unless that's overlays upon an area with high fire risk. Well, we might want to do something in there, treat it with prescribed fire, do some fuels treatment to try and increase that resiliency of that stand. Another really important feature for us is our history. This is a map of the regeneration harvest that's occurred on the forest there, from going back all the way to 1913 in the northern part of the forest, all the way through 2002. And what this allows us to do is really focus for that Western Cascades South subunit, you know, that you want to identify where your younger forest is. Well, this is a pretty easy way to do it there. you've got a map of where that younger forest has been created across the landscape. Honestly, though, on the Umpqua, over the past 15, 20 years, we've really been focusing on thinning our young stands, our young previously regenerated stands. And so we're kind of on the cusp of running out of these younger stands for the next 10, 15 years that we can benefit through thinning, just because we've kind of accelerated our rate of thinning to meet our timber target over the time, focusing on these younger stands. And so now we're at the precipice where we need to start looking at these in conjunction with our older stands and fire risk to plan restoration projects that we can also provide some timber volume off of. And then another couple layers of consideration there. There's the forest resources inventory. This came out as a GTR several years ago, put together by Connie Harrington. I want to say it's GTR 584. It was basically, they hand digitized, mapped areas of forest inventory of Oregon and Washington, and they mapped out deforested burns. And so those aren't the area of entire wildfire perimeter, but those are the areas where we had stand replacement wildfires. And then same in 1914, the Oregon Department of Forestry did a mapping of the forest stand conditions and age structure of Oregon forests, and they mapped burnt areas not restocked and also burnt areas restocking. And so what that tells us here, we've used some of these historic fire areas to go back and look and see, is there an opportunity for restoration within this previously burnt area? In particular, if it was stocked, but even if it wasn't restocked, is there a single cohort of trees that could benefit from some diversification? And then the other thing that we look at is, boy, look at the size and configuration of fire across the landscape, of high severity fire across the landscape. It was a lot smaller and more patchy when you consider what's happened over the past, 22 years, 30 years. The majority of this fire that you see, those red outlines there, are fires that have occurred from 2002 on. A few of them, are from the late 80s, but the larger fires are primarily from 2002 on. And so, as you can see from this slide, our legacy of fire suppression and the way we fight fire has changed over the past century there, and that's changing how much habitat we have. This is a little bit apples to oranges to a certain degree, though I want to acknowledge, because these 1970 through 2014 are total fire perimeter. It's not total fire high severity wildfire. So much of these habitats are still existing as green trees, were under burn, but then there's portions of them, some higher, some lower. On average, we average between 2002 and 2013, we averaged about 30% high severity of any one of our fires, but that varies from 55% to, like the Beaver fire was around 10%, or Whiskey fire was around 10%. So we also use the fire history layer to, in conjunction with the large fire suitability model, that these fires validate a lot of that large fire suitability model, and many of them are in those bright red areas. And so where we have bright red areas that don't have fires, those are kind of areas that we've tried to prioritize more heavily for potential treatment to reduce the risk of habitat loss to fire. And then I stole this one from Tom Spies, and Tom's not here, but I'll give him credit, because when he said this, it was like a little poem to me. I really liked it. Topography as a template for diversity. When we're talking now about thinking about planning for ecological forestry, talking about doing a little bit more heavy-handed treatment, we want to be able to model or mimic what was there in the face of those natural disturbances. And so here, what this is south aspects intersected with slope. So that green is south aspects with less than 20% slope, yellow south aspects 20 to 40% slope, and then red, that south aspect greater than 40% slope. And that red, and to a lesser extent that yellow, those are areas where fires would have burned on a hotter basis, more likely to be stand replacement in a mixed area fire regime. And so those areas, when you combine with our plantation history in the Western Cascade South, and even when compared to even natural stands on the southern part of our forest, those are areas where we can consider being a little bit more heavy-handed in our treatment there, in order to mimic those historic disturbance regimes in the locations on the landscape in which they're more likely to occur. And so the inverse to that is north aspects there. So north aspects and lower degree slope. So that green is north aspect, less than 20% slope. That light blue is north aspect, 20 to 40, and that dark blue, greater than 60% slope. Well, those lower sloped north aspects, those are areas where if we've got younger stands, boy, let's really get in there and diversify those and get them on a trajectory to being older forest and maintain those on the landscape longer. Those are really good opportunities for restoration of younger stands to maintain in the future, in the face of future disturbance. And also, those are areas where if it's already good habitat, sweet, let's leave it alone. Okay. Couple other layers, ponderosa pine distribution, and I mentioned, these are correlated with each other, and it shows up better there than it does on my monitor. But ponderosa pine, on the Umpqua presents a really good restoration opportunity there. In many areas, these pines are being blinked out as a result of encroachment and fire suppression there, and so we're trying to identify areas where we have more pines, both ponderosa pine and sugar pine, as areas to do release treatments there and to maintain that feature diversity on the landscape. And then the last habitat variable I'll talk about is Oregon white oak distribution. The Umpqua, I know it doesn't look like a lot, and that's kind of the point. We don't have a lot of Oregon white oak on us, but we do have some. And what we have out there is incredibly important to keep on the landscape. Not necessarily from a spotted owl perspective, but from a Rocky Mountain elk perspective, from a mule deer perspective, from a butterfly perspective, from a bee perspective, from a neotropical migrant songbird perspective. Those are good opportunities of restoration for us, and we need to keep those persistent across the landscape, and we can identify those and thin those to keep those persistent on the landscape so they don't get over encroached. And just to kind of sum up some take-homes here, we don't have, these are things we're thinking about. We're still working this out. We're trying to balance between restoration objectives described earlier and then also providing forest products. I mean, we're a multiple use agency. We've got a timber target associated with our forest, which our funding is partially based upon. And so we need to balance those. And we need to balance that within and outside of critical habitat. But when we're in critical habitat, we need to be smart about what we're doing out there and be focused on restoration and look for opportunities that are mutually beneficial for spotted owls and for providing forest products there. And then we're trying to work from large to small, identifying restoration opportunities at a landscape level, and then working down once we get out in the field to get specific units identified. And then this last one is really key, and I really want to thank Jim Threlkill and Scott Center, his guy who works for him on level 1 team, that they're really gracious in allowing us some flexibility in interpreting critical habitat, because that line between the Klamath East and the Western Cascade South is not a bright line in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot of dry forest within that Western Cascade South that we have some opportunities and need to restore, and they've been really helpful in working with us at a project-by-project basis of being able to identify those and identify how they can be mutually compatible with spotted owl recovery. And so with that, questions? So yeah, so your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in areas where we have done previous field treatments and then areas where we've had subsequent wildfires, how effective have those been in maintaining habitat elements? I wish we had a bigger sample size to be able to provide you that local specific information. We just don't. We have not been treating fuels in any way, shape, or form on the scale and intensity in which we need to be able to maintain those. There's a bunch of examples elsewhere, but on the Umpqua, what I can point to is that in 2002, post-fire monitoring of the Apple fire, those plantations that had been previously thinned versus those plantations that had previously not been thinned, the levels of mortality, the high severity canopy crown fire were much greater in those untreated stands. But we don't have, that's just on a few specific stands. We don't have a large landscape sample to provide.
Josh, did you do this analysis and strategy for the whole forest and then give it to the districts as a tool when they started looking at focusing their energy in specific areas?
So the question was, did I develop this at a forest level and then give it to the districts? And no, what we've been talking about this at a forest level in our integrated restoration planning process. We've been providing this information to the districts, but we haven't any one project where we've applied all of these individual things. These are all things that individual projects consider, but we're just starting to steer the ship from just plantation thinning into something a little bit different. And so this is where we'd like to move towards, but we haven't fully got there yet. Did that answer your question, Carol? Okay.
You said you take the GNN layer as a baseline for sort of jumping off point, and then you go out and validate that on the ground.
Mhm.
You'll validate that. Is the GNN layer the only vegetative layer that you're using to start your process of habitat verification or field validation, or are you using another veg layer? And if so, what is that layer? And the other question is, how big of a area do you go and ground truth? Are you just focusing on circle, like core areas around known owls, or how big of an area do you ground truth the entire project area? Or
Okay, so let me try and repeat that one there. So the first question, I believe, was do we use GNN as the basis for our entire veg layer for our forest? GNN is the only contiguous habitat layer that we have. It's got a ton of different stand metrics. But what we're not using GNN strictly. We look at it as a rough cut for pine and stuff, but those two habitat suitability models, the Fish and Wildlife Service habitat suitability model, and then the 15-year monitoring report habitat suitability model, GNN provides some of the basis for the vegetation in there, but the model also includes other things outside of GNN. But to be more to the point, we do not have a seamless vegetation layer more accurate than the GNN for our forest. The closest thing we have is that regeneration layer, so we can get stand ages there, but outside of that, we don't have anything. And so as far as validation, when we validate the NERF layer, it's when we identify potential treatment units that we go and validate that. So we don't validate an entire watershed at a time. We just don't have that amount of time. But before we're going to treat, or when we're going to identify a unit to treat, we're going to walk that unit and see, was that call of NERF habitat or was that call of foraging habitat accurate?
so you're doing the field validation of the unit, but not necessarily if that unit were, say, within a home range of no air, out air or something like that. Do you field validate that home range to decide whether or not it's, at below threshold or something along those lines? Do you also validate those owl core areas?
The owl core use areas, no, if obviously driving around and walking around there and doing our surveys, we do take some spot checks as far as validating that habitat. But if we're not going to treat it, we don't focus as much. We're going to, by and large, that model is pretty accurate in identifying our NERF. It's not 100% accurate, which is why we want to go out and field verify it for consultation purposes, so we can say what we're taking, what we're leaving in a stand level treatment unit. But as far as what is in outside the treatment areas, we're generally using the model output itself and using that as the baseline for amount of habitat. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Save more questions for Josh at the end here. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.
I don't know what it'll do if you just pull it up. I'm always looking for issues of the next big workshop thing to put on, and I'm thinking that a fall workshop on ecological forestry, silviculture, and older stands might be something of interest. Show of hands. Yeah, because I don't think Norm is thinking that's just heavy-handed forestry, do you? As he laughs, yeah. I think it takes old growth off the table first, and then it moves on.